actually just ran a survey that will probably be released by the time this podcast airs, where we recruited 1,000 U.S. university students from all over the country, and we asked them questions about progress, and we asked them specifically connected to their college experience, because what we were interested in is, what are people learning? You hear all these criticisms about colleges and indoctrination, but we wanted to ask students, what do they think they're learning? And so we asked them, based on what you've learned in college so far, do you think the world has gotten better over the last 50 years? And we even gave them specific examples, because you could say, well, it depends on what you mean by it gotten better, right? So we had examples like things that we knew based on the human progress and other data points that had gotten better, like poverty, right? That poverty has been decreasing, and I actually
radically and immensely,
right. And so what was amazing to me, and I can actually bring up, so I don't get the numbers wrong. So we asked people, based on what you've learned in college so far, is the world getting better over the last 50 years? And not even 50% of students said yes. So half of students don't think that the world has gotten better. And we asked the same questions about the US. Has the US gotten better? And very similar answers. Only about a quarter of the students, of US college students, said that they're optimistic about the future of the world based on what they've learned in college so far. Only 11% of US college students said that their college experience has made them have a more positive view of the US, whereas 45% said that their college experiences made them have a more negative view of the US. The rest said their view hasn't changed. And only half of students are optimistic about their own future, and their ability to make a difference in the world. So I could go on with all these statistics, but essentially we found a number of reasons to think that students. Well, let me back up a little bit. So if you think about objectively, if you think about American college students using the terms that are often used in this discussion, which is the concept of privilege. Like if you think about the concept of privilege, to be born in America, to live in America, you've already kind of won the lottery. I'm not saying America's the greatest, the greatest place, but compared to a lot of places in the world, there's opportunity. There's a lot more opportunity here, right? So only a small percentage of people have that privilege already, right? And then on top of that, only a minority of people get to attend university. I mean, the vast majority of the world doesn't have the opportunity to attend university, right? So at some level, it seems obviously true that if you have the privilege of attending university in America, you would think that you should be pretty optimistic about your situation in life and have a lot of gratitude about it. But what we're finding, and of course these aren't, this is just a poll. These aren't experiments or anything. We're not controlling for personality or other potential factors. But we're getting a snapshot of college students not being very, many of them not seeing that, there's been progress. So what are they learning in college where they're not saying, hey, wow, like maybe things aren't perfect, but they've certainly gotten better. They're not seeing that. And then on top of that, they're not particularly hopeful or optimistic about the future. And they don't seem to have a real sense of agency, right? That they can make a difference in the world. And again, you would think that if you were sufficiently blessed to live in the United States and go to college, that might, from my perspective, that might come with a certain level of responsibility, right? That's, you're very fortunate and you have a duty to do something in the world, to help others, to make a difference, to make your community and your society better. But it seems like a good portion of students aren't particularly optimistic about that and don't really see that they have a place.
Well, I talked to Tupi and to Bjorn Lomberg and to Matt Ridley. These are all optimistic sorts of characters who done a lot to document the radical improvement in absolute terms of human existence over especially the last 30 years. And all of them know that they have a marketing problem, right? It's like, yeah, well, why isn't this compelling? Because it's an uphill battle to get this information out there. And the question is why? And it seems to me that it has something to do with, it's in some sense too materialistic. Like, not that that's bad exactly, because isn't it good to have enough to eat and all of that? Yeah. But there's some impetus, some spiritual impetus or something like that that seems to be lacking. And then there's another issue. I don't know if you thought about this or not, but, you know, in the Christian tradition, there's apocalypse. And it's sort of projected in some sense out into the spiritual world. So the end of the world is at hand, but who knows when?
Right. Well,
so it's projected, like utopia is projected. And so then you might ask yourself, well, what happens if it isn't projected? Is there a utopian and an apocalyptic tendency in human thinking? And if so, what happens if it's not contained within a religious structure? And so I would wonder to what degree the pessimists in your survey have apocalyptic visions of the future, because there's certainly no shortage of suggestions that we're continually facing something that looks like an apocalyptic nightmare. And it isn't obvious to me that that's the case.
Right. Yeah. No, you see this with what's become almost a religious environmentalism, right? It's very apocalyptic. Depending on who's talking and on what day, it varies from we've only got like a decade left before the planet turns into an uninhabitable hellscape to, on the more optimistic side, you'll see some people say, well, we can still do something to mitigate it. But you do see, again, there are plenty of environmental activists that I think are very practical, very solution-oriented, very entrepreneurial, who are thinking about technologies and strategies to make.
Lomberg is like that.
Right. But then there is an element of these activists that it is almost like an apocalyptic meaning making religion, where, because the reason I say that is because it seems to accompany this antinatalist and view of, it's almost as if the best. So how you might ask, well, what's that got to do with meaning? Well, it's almost as if what they're arguing is the most meaningful thing that humans can do is go away. Right? Like,
yes. Well, you see
surrender the planet to the other species because we've screwed it up.
Well, and the thing about the apocalyptic, when I grew up, the apocalypse was basically the threat of nuclear war, which seemed very real and seems to have at least vanished to some degree in terms of what people fear. And maybe that's because the actual risk has declined. I would say that's the primary reason. I mean, it isn't obvious to me that Russia is going to attack the United States with nuclear bombs. So, and China and America, well, it's not a full-fledged Cold War yet. But back in the 60s, there were many people who were entirely convinced that everyone was going to be starving and that we were going to run out of resources by the year 2000. I mean, the population bomb, Ehrlich's book, the Club of Rome, all these people said, oh, we're going to overpopulate the planet and we're going to run out of resources. And we didn't, and we aren't going to, by all appearances. We're going to peak at about 9 billion. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if in 100 years, the fundamental problem is that there aren't enough children. I mean, I don't know, and who knows, because 100 years is a long way away. But that apocalypse, those apocalypses didn't occur. And we have the environmental apocalypse. And it'd be interesting to see the more pessimistic students that you described. Do you suppose would they be more likely to fall into the search for meaning camp? Would they be the ones that were more susceptible to alternative quasi-religious beliefs? Do you know any of that yet? Because it'd be interesting to look at all that in relationship to views of the future.
Yeah, no, so there are some data points that I can bring up, not from my survey, but that I think speak to this issue. And other issues you raised, including the materialism issue that you brought up about progress. So for one, there has been global data looking at meaning across different countries. And as it turns out, people in poorer countries report higher meaning in life than people in richer countries. Even when you control for religiosity, the effect remains. Religiosity explains part of it. Religious people have more meaning, but even when you control for that remains. So what's the story there? Well, it could be that in poorer countries, people are naturally more interdependent. Right? You're not as individualistic. You have to help each other, and so it's much easier to see how your life matters, right? People depend on you.
Well, you know, I just interviewed a man who was held in Guantanamo Bay for 14 years and released. And he came from Mauritania. He came from a tribal society, like literally a tribal society. He's not even one generation removed from that. And he went to be educated in Germany when he was an older teenager. And when he got to Germany, he was alone in a room for the first time in his life. And he said it really upset him. And he said, we weren't talking about meaning specifically, but that the meaning in his life was the interdependence with all of his family members, whom he was never isolated from, ever. And he said, specifically, he talked about his mother and said that she was an eternal source of meaning for him, and that dissolved very rapidly when he was isolated and individual. And he suffered repeated bouts of depression before he ended up in Guantanamo Bay. And so I'd never talked to somebody who had come from a tribal background like that and was struck by that degree of interdependence. I mean, we don't know. And, you know, the students that you're describing that are pessimistic about the future, many material things have improved, but maybe we are more atomized than we were 50 years ago. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
I think families are more fragmented than they were 50 years ago, arguably.
Yeah.
And some people, I think Putnam, again, have argued that social institutions that pull people together have become much less prevalent as well. I think, did he write Bowling Alone? Was that Putnam?
Yeah, he did. Yeah. No, I think that's true. I mean, that's one of the things that I've been thinking out, because I naturally lean, kind of libertarian, classical liberal. And so I think this is something I'm, as a psychologist, I'm always talking to people in this space, because it's, if you're smart and have high trait self-control and are relatively successful, then it's pretty easy to be libertarian and think, well, I can choose whatever I want to believe in, and I don't want to tell anyone to do anything. The extreme libertarians, like, I don't want anyone to tell anyone to do anything ever. But one thing I'm always telling these people is, but that's not how most people are. And one of the challenges that comes with the success of the free market, which I'm a big advocate for, is affluence, right? Like, markets have made, capitalism has made societies wealthy, but potentially have created this psychological vulnerability that you're talking about. So on the one hand, yes, we've progressed in many ways along material lines, but to what extent has that potentially contributed to or created certain vulnerabilities in our social lives? Because I don't have to even get along with my neighbors if I have enough money. I can just hire people to do things, right? I can just pay people for services without actually having to compromise or negotiate. And it turns out,
or develop attachments,
right?
Or cooperate.
Yeah.
Or inspire or mentor or lead or any of those things, right? And then also, you don't do those things that you pay other people to do, which is a form of loss often as well.
Right, exactly. So I think this is taking us back to the unifying religion idea. I think this is a good example where you might need something in a free market society. Having religion is a good counter. And that's not a novel, of course. That's not a novel observation, because a lot of people have talked about this. In fact, I'm in a business school, and one of the growing popular areas that people are interested in is ethical leadership. And the idea is people have looked at, like the financial crisis and all this, the crony capitalism and corruption of big business and these things. And people are like, oh yeah, markets are great. But if you have people that do bad things and make unethical decisions, they can exploit people and they can take advantage of people. And so there is this kind of ethical leadership movement. Like if you want the market to work, then you need people to follow certain ethical rules, not just laws, but certain ethical principles. And in a lot of ways, that's a secular repackaging of what might have been in the past. It's just like, well, you have a business world, but you also have the separate religious world, and that religious world is where you get your morals, right? Your business world might tell you how to sell a product, but if selling that product makes you sin or makes you violate certain moral rules, then that's a check on you. It's like, I'm not supposed to do that. But if you strip away that moral framework and say, well, anything goes, it's all about making money, or it's all about material gain, or it's all about
maximizing quarterly profits, which also makes it very short term.
Right. So these things, so in a lot of ways, I think these belief systems balance that. And part of the